There's a perception that Airbnb has added greatly to our housing crisis, particularly in the availability of homes to rent. One suggestion is that about 12,000 of the 30,000 short-term tourist lettings currently on the market could be suitable for long-term residential accommodation. Now, the government apparently is planning tighter planning controls on platforms like Airbnb as part of its campaign to bring more homes back into the long-term rental market. No firm information as yet as to what measures will be in the short-term tourist letting bill, other than this well-flagged requirement on landlords to register. Maura Ní Murchú is Chief Executive of the Irish Self-Catering Federation. What's your position on Airbnb being restricted perhaps in what it can offer?
Hello, Matt. How are you doing? Well, I suppose our first position is that we call the industry self-catering, and we have been there for decades, long before Airbnb was ever discovered. Airbnb is a new way to book, or in the case of owners, in which to sell their accommodation. It is not the full industry. It's part of the industry. It's one of those things called online travel agents, or OTAs. So the government is trying to put restrictions on them, but it is seriously affecting the small family businesses all over Ireland, which have been here for generations, who are offering accommodation. Oh,
so you're fearful that you will suffer as a byproduct of any clampdown on Airbnb, is it?
Yes, I'm afraid we are, because when you referred to it in the beginning, you said Airbnb, but it's all self-catering that is being affected, because the term is used quite a lot now to refer to self-catering in general. And when the government went to Europe to try and get a regulation, they said that they would be able to get 10,700 properties back into the long-term market. They didn't say Airbnb, they said self-catering. And of those, they were saying things like that they could get 1,800 back in Kerry, 1,400 back in Cork. And if you look at the numbers, it's mostly properties along the Wild Atlantic Way, not necessarily on Airbnb, which they're talking about bringing back into the long-term market.
Okay, but do these properties have planning permission to be self-catering facilities?
They have planning permission as houses, but not necessarily as self-catering facilities, because we opened up long before the regulation came in where you had to have planning. Now, if we apply for planning, we're probably not going to get it. So if you're in an area which is a rent pressure zone, which initially was the Dublin area in 2019, it now covers 80% of the country, including the full counties of Waterford and Limerick, the tourism areas of Westport, Killarney. I could go on, Matt, and places, and none of those will get planning permission to be allowed to continue with their business.
So this is the entire Irish self-catering business that you believe is at risk?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Ivana Bacik, housing spokesperson for the Labour Party as well as the party leader, do you have sympathy for those in the Irish Self-Catering Federation and with Airbnb?
Well, good afternoon, Matt, and thank you for inviting me on the programme. I think it's a really interesting and important issue, clearly, because, of course, I have a huge empathy with Maura and with her colleagues who've been running self-catering, operations and businesses for a long time, as you say, Maura. But I think, the reality here is that everyone agrees on the need for regulation of the short-term rental sector, and it isn't about any one company or any one individual. It's about ensuring that we have a proper balance. Matt, I think your listeners will be well aware that we have a housing crisis in this country. We have over 14,000 people in homelessness, including over 4,000 children. A really shameful statistic. Each number, of course, reflecting a real human experience of an appalling condition to live in Ireland in 2024. So, that's the context we're in. Everyone, I think, and I'm not speaking for the government in any way, obviously, I'm an opposition party, but I think everyone agrees on the need for regulation. And indeed, there's now a European imperative, because since April, the EU has adopted a regulation, the short-term rental regulation, which all member states will be required to implement by May of 2026, which will require much greater transparency and much greater regulation of short-term letting generally. And I suppose, Matt, again, this is in the context where not only in Ireland do we have a housing crisis, but across Europe we're seeing real concerns about preponderance and even dominance of short-term rentals, of Airbnbs, for example, in traditionally living sustainable communities like, I'm thinking, for example, protests your listeners be aware of that are going on in Barcelona and in Malaga, just because the balance hasn't been got right in some cities, and we've seen too many short-term lettings dominating. And indeed in Ireland, just to come back to our own situation, a study just last year finding 18,000 short-term lettings advertised on one platform alone for short-term lettings across the country, and less than 1,300 advertised for long-term rental on daft.ie. So that's a real concern, therefore, that short-term lettings have, I suppose, that the balance has been tipped and we haven't got sufficient regulations. I think
but Ivana,
proposals coming from the EU, and we will need to transpose that.
But also, is there not an argument that if somebody owns a property, it's theirs to do it as they want, and if they can get more return financially from short-term lettings than long-term lettings, then that is a logical thing for them to do with their asset?
Well, I think we already recognise through our planning and indeed our legal system that there have to be certain regulations for the common good, the interest of the community, and people can't have, for example, or at least it would be most unfair if people were to be allowed, for example, to have very busy, very loud and obstreperous parties every night. That's the sort of thing that, of course, there's no legal rule about. But in the interest of good neighbourliness and good planning, we do have curbs and controls and regulations on what people do with their property, and I think that's fair. And again, most people would appreciate that. And indeed, there's already requirements for planning permission in Irish law, where, for example, homeowners in rent pressure zones let out their home for more than 90 days in any 1 year for short-term lets. So there's already some regulation there. And of course, if anyone lets out a second property for short-term lets in a rent pressure zone, again, there's a requirement for planning permission. And Maura has spoken about that. But of course, local authorities will judge the application in the normal way, and they will, I think, take cognizance of where the property is.
Okay, but
the
Ivana,
new rule requires, and actually, platforms themselves have sought more regulation. What the new rules will mean, and the government have put forward some proposals, but I understand they're going to have to be revised in light of the EU regulation now. And the government's proposal will require a register of all properties available for short-term rental.
Yes,
and I think again that's a sensible provision, and it's one that.
But Ivana, there is a listener here as well says Airbnb is the only alternative to the extremely overpriced hotels in the country. Now, I'm sure Maura will argue that there's plenty of other Irish self-catering options other than Airbnb. But the point is that people, if we're going to encourage domestic tourism or even people coming from overseas, we have to have options for them that they can afford. And indeed, throughout the country, there are many hotels which are now being used for other purposes to their original intent. So we need these houses for our tourists.
Again, Matt, it is absolutely about balance. It's about ensuring that there is a balance, particularly in residential communities, particularly where there is huge pressure, where people cannot get homes to live in long term, that we have a balance, that we don't see what has happened, and I've referenced other cities where, communities really feel the balance is wrong, and that there's been a preponderance of short-term lettings, and that has been at the expense of enabling longer-term communities and longer-term individuals and families to stay in areas. And your listeners again might be aware of cities like Venice, where again this has been an issue for a long time. The Balearic Islands, Mallorca, where so many Irish visit. So it is about getting a balance right. It's about ensuring regulation, and indeed it's not about singling out any one platform. And I entirely agree with Maura. There are loads of options there. People have lots of different ways of booking holiday homes and properties, and of course that should continue. But it does need to be regulated.
Okay.
We need to have transparency, and we need balance.